What, in your words, is political ecology, and what does it mean to study the Amazon through that lens?
Well, political ecology is an approach. It's a multidisciplinary approach. It's not a theory. It's a way of looking at things, looking at the science of the environment, the politics that often revolve around the environment, and the political economies and power relations. So each of those has a different set of methodologies. So it's kind of determined by your question, what is it that you're trying to look at? When, in my case, personally, what I was trying to look at is to understand the dynamics of deforestation and its impacts. So I came into political ecology looking at what were the soil impacts of converting forest to pasture. And you'll be amazed to hear, because of the nature of tropical forests, if you burn them up, they work as fertilizer for a couple of years and then the stuff goes down and it's not sustainable. But that wasn't enough of an explanation because in essence, what you had to look at is why was this land use that was essentially unsustainable being so supported? And then what you saw was a different story about a military regime that was looking to occupy Amazonia as part of a long set of, how should we say, geopolitical concerns, and as part of a broader set of technological transformations so it was large scale corporate ranching that was going in, and they made a number of fiscal incentives, credit incentives, and other kinds of what we call institutional rents, like building roads and stuff, so that these then could be captured by these large scale ranches that were being put in. So that the land use was not sustainable was not that interesting, but all the other ancillary things that went with the land use were where the tax write-offs, the tax freedom, and these were not nothing companies. They were like Volkswagen and the Catholic Church and the Swift Meats, which has now been absorbed by JBS and so on. So, in essence, what started me on this was the question about what were the dynamics of the Amazon, and then what once I saw what was going on with this soil nutrient decline and the lack of sustainability at that time, what were the alternatives to it? So the alternatives were multiple, but you had to sort of pretend that the Amazon wasn't an empty space. You had to sort of imagine it as being full of different kinds of people doing different kinds of things in different kinds of economies. So this led me into a bunch of things. One of them was looking at indigenous soil management. Because one of the things is that soils, there's this hypothesis that you never had complex societies in Amazonia because the soils were so crummy that you could just do a couple years of shifting cultivation and then you had to move on. In fact, that wasn't the case. So I'll sort of lead you through each of my little stages in this. And even early on, people were worried about what was going to happen if you started to deforest because it's a really important climate sink. So I worked with an anthropologist named Daryl Posey, who was an ethnobiologist. That is, so he was looking at sort of indigenous science and indigenous approaches to science. And those are both what we call ontologies, different ways of being, and different ways of knowing the world, what we call epistemologies. And they have a different way of looking at the world, and you can sort of, they have a different soil classification system and so on. But the premise really of Daryl's was that they actually had quite advanced science. And so we began to look at the whole question of soil management, and what came up was this whole idea that, first of all, these villages had been in place for a long time, and there's other studies that places that have been continuously occupied for 1,000 years in the humid tropics, which this soil determinist view was supposed to not happen. And then what what were the implications of this? And so we did a bunch of studies on this, and I can send you the references if your student friends want to take a look at it. But what we came up with was this whole thing of biochar and cool fires that basically create these dark, what are called Amazonian dark earths. And the thing about them is this, and you might think about this as a way of helping people understand it, because we know that mountain areas are not that great for agriculture, but if you put in terraces, you can have extremely dense populations in mountain areas, and we know this throughout the tropics and throughout the world. We also know that in areas which don't have a lot of rain-fed water, or have very seasonal water, that irrigation makes those landscapes capable of supporting complex societies. So terra preta is a technology that's equivalent for humid tropical soils that are really crummy. So, in essence, what this does is it means that this hypothesis that had been running around that you could never develop complex systems in the Amazonian world because the soils were crummy began to crumble. And then what happened is various other kinds of techniques came into play. Once you started to look for Amazonian dark earths, you could find them in many, many places. That is, they were quite widespread because they were good soils and often used by local populations for their own productivity. But the other thing is that what it meant is that instead of being a place of sort of semi-nomadic barbarians, in fact, that it had a history that could have supported very complex civilizations. Now, I'm a geographer. The geography department that I went to was one in Berkeley, where they had been working on indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous production systems for just ages. And their whole view was simply that there were a lot of technologies that permitted the elaboration of complex livelihoods. Well, you then got some more archaeologists on the scene, and you've got things like LIDAR, which is this remote fixed wing radar sensing that looks through the canopy. So even if there's forest cover, it can start to see elements of these landscapes. Also, you had deforestation going on, and so places were being uncovered, what we call geoglyphs, that are these large scale landscape structures with roads, with orientations, and all of a sudden, this world that had seemed to be an empty world ripe for the taking. There's a reason for this. An ahistorical world in which its denizens were largely seen as being, oh, like a sort of different kind of primate, maybe a larger one, but not having more impact on the landscape. All of a sudden, you began to see that this was an area, this region had been as civilizationally dense as elsewhere. And also, there was just a lot of other kinds of artifact evidence, beautiful gold work, complex pottery, various other kinds of things, as well as the architecture itself. Another line of analysis actually came from looking what we call historical ecology, which was looking at the kinds of useful species that indigenous people used as medicines, as building materials, as the stuff weaving for various things, just the whole range of things that people can use. And what began to be clear was what had seemed to be like this wild, natural, biotic environment had actually been incredibly created through human action of planting, replanting, developing landscape through various kinds of activities. So that in essence, what happened is the sort of you went in a dynamic away from sort of the empty world inhabited by nomadic, basically barbarians, into a recasting of this as one a densely inhabited anthropogenic Amazon. And what had seemed to be wild was, in fact, complex agroforestry systems, complex land management, replanting, reorienting, creating these kinds of resource islands as people moved through the landscape. So it's a different sort of model of occupation, one that doesn't really fit our temperate zone version, but one that's really based in diversity and complexity and had very dense populations. And one of the hallmarks of that was the development of really complex soil management that produced these Amazonian dark earths, the terra preta. So from that, then I went into other kinds of forest economies, babasu, which is a palm, rubber tapping and rubber economies. So that to start to think about really the social lives of forests and human adaptation within forest ecosystems as an alternative to this relentless destruction that was going on. And also, as the dictatorship ended, civil society became much stronger, and so they began to have more of a political voice. So it's now, Amazonia is pretty contested. I'm sure people have seen pictures of the climate meetings in November with all the people in the streets and indigenous people and others with those fabulous headdresses and so on. But in essence, there's a lot of conversation going on about the model of development. And given that Amazonia is one of the key tipping points in the planetary climate, this is not a trivial or sort of folkloric set of questions. There's a lot of scientists who would certainly side with indigenous people saying, really, you need to keep this forest up, and that forests can be very productive of human livelihoods. But let me get back to my point about Amazonian tipping points, which is if you look at the what are called the big tipping points, like the Antarctic glaciers or the Greenland glaciers, or what's called the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, which is the one that sort of goes along your land there, the East Coast, and then comes down, goes around, and then it sort of warms up Europe. Europe would be a lot colder without the AMOC. And things like the El Niños, most of those areas aren't inhabited. They reflect sort of the geophysics of the planet and the warming of the planet through various mechanisms that it's being warmed. But in the Amazon, what is happening is that deforestation is the main source for most of these countries' CO2 emissions. And they're volatile, they go up and down, but they can be controlled. So because there's people doing this. So that this is not like some inexorable process of heat transfer or something. It's much more linked to human agency. And what that means is that it can change. So we have examples of this. So from 2004 to about 2012, the deforestation rate in the Amazon dropped by 82%. So human agency can slow deforestation. It was followed by Jair Bolsonaro, who often is called the tropical Trump, and who defunded all the science, took all the regulation away, and then deforestation went up, shot up. So, and then afterwards, you had again a regulatory state come in to slow deforestation down and to also protect the rights of indigenous and traditional and other kinds of populations that make their living from a standing forest. So, as I always like to say, in a nutcase, what you can see in this sort of story of political ecology is that more in complex systems, there's more than one thing that goes on. And political ecology, as I said, is an approach. It's not like a particular theory. You use the kind of necessary analytic tools that you need, whether these are ethnographic, economics, political science, ecological science, soil science, archaeology, and remote sensing. And to create, in my case in Amazonia, to help develop a narrative to understand what's going on in this place that's continental dimensions and is so critical to our planetary, especially your future.
Yeah. So you've answered a lot of the questions that I was going to on, but I have one. So on a
Uh-huh.
scale from 1 to 5, how urgent, in your opinion, is the Amazon right now and why?
It's very urgent. It's urgent because we're in a, this will not have escaped your clever colleagues that we're kind of in a cusp. We're going through a bunch of big scale geopolitical regime changes. And two of these have immediate implications for Amazonia. One was the Venezuela decapitation and the emphasis on oil. And remember that Amazonia, it's not just Venezuela that has oil, that virtually all the Amazon countries, and there are nine of them, one of them is a French department, but let's pretend it's a country, as sovereignties, let's call them sovereignties. All of them have oil, if not on their in their Amazon lands, like the area before the Andes rise up in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia. Then there's this other little trench that goes on, and then there's the coastal area, which has all this underwater oil. So this is the largest sort of oil basin in the world right now. It's not for nothing that American soldiers are carrying out activities in Ecuador, partly because it was a former petrostate. So there you can imagine what that seems like. And then of course the situation in Venezuela, where what's called the Arco Minero is the area in which you find the Orinoco Basin. These are part of the both of these opposite sides of the continent, but both of them are part of Amazonian biomes essentially. But they just started pumping oil at the front mouth of the Amazon itself in Brazil. And then the British Guyana has been a kind of a petro vassal of Exxon. Most of the plays there are owned by Exxon. So it's a very complex oil landscape. So let's just leave it at
Yeah.
that. Then there's another set of things, which is after China. Brazil has most of it has 25, so it has 25% of the global rare earths, which are, of course, extremely necessary at this moment, including things also that we might not think of as rare earths, but things like bauxite and so on, and manganese, but also things like nickel and molybdenum and a bunch of them. And there is a huge gold rush going on. So gold, again, it's pretty volatile. It was up to 5,000. It's come down, but it's often used as a hedge against economic volatility. And so there's a big push of gold mining going on. And most of this is illegal gold mining, and it's carried out through criminal groups, cartels, including those in Armenia and mainly Mexican cartels. So it's all quite complicated. And so we're in this sort of moment of plundered economies in which the impacts on Amazonian forests themselves are likely to be very strong. But it's also important to realize that these are also contested, that these often occur in indigenous lands or traditional peoples' lands. And so there's a contest over whether the forests will stand or whether they'll die in the process of running our cars basically. So it's a very it's I would rate it, if five is the top, is
Yes.
five the top, I would rate it five
Yeah.
because it's a tipping point area, because it's in the sites of very large scale plunder economies, and third because it's contested. So we'll see what happens, as they say. But all of these make Amazonian questions very central to the future of the planet and also to our general futures more broadly.
Yeah. Who else do you think we should be talking to? What other scientists or researchers? who do you think young people really need to hear from and about?
Well, there's something called the Scientific Panel on the Amazon, and it's a part of the Sustainable Development Network. It's about 200. It's like the IPCC, it's like the Climate Network, only it's for Amazonia, Pan-Amazonia, all of the countries I talked about, the nine sovereignties. And they have a lot of youth engagement. That is, there's a if you go on, they have a YouTube channel, I think. I'm sure they do, but and it's so you would go on the scientific panel for the Amazon spa, and you can then see a lot of interaction with Amazonian youth reflecting on things, scientists reflecting on things, and there's huge amount of resources produced by the scientists themselves. Often there's also these what are called policy briefs that are not, they don't go into, they're highly cited and highly referenced, but they're not in that dense language that you would get if you were reading a paper in Nature or Science or something like that. So there are lots of resources available. The other thing is that there's been very good reporting in the Guardian newspaper, which is out of England, and they have a very good, they have a bunch of environmental scientists based in Brazil who report on it. Another really good resource. Oop, have I, someone has gone half. Whoop, there. What was that? Anyway, another really good resource is something called Manga Bay, Mongabay, which is a journal. It's a bunch of journalism and journal reportage on the tropics. Really good. So those are three sort of areas, one being more visual and TikToky, and the others being more classically scientific, but really worth taking a look and really great journalism.
Yeah. So, if every teenager on Earth had to hear one last final concluding sentence from you, what would it be?
Gee, get cracking. It's, this stuff is very serious. This climate stuff is serious. This transition, this moment of change is very, very serious. So pay attention, I guess, would be my words of wisdom here.
So, that's most of the questions I have for you. Do you have any feedback about the process, my email, anyone who I should be talking to next?
No, I think this is fine. If you want to keep talking on this, you might really go and take a look at some of the scientific panel for the Amazon stuff and see, or there's also, because this process has been, like global witness and so on, it's been quite a violent process. So you might want to talk to some of these things like Amazon Watch. The other thing is that there's been the protagonist in a lot of this in Forest Defenders has been a lot of Indigenous women have taken leadership roles. So there's lots of things, there's lots of entryways into it. It's a big thing. And also, if you have relatives in the American tropics, and there's in your neck of the woods, you have a lot of Brazilians, you have a lot of Ecuadorians and Bolivians and so on. Find out more. Find out more. There is good access to information.